Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Trevor Freeman, and I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. We're based here in Asheville at the Smith McDowell House Museum, but we focus on the broader Western North Carolina region also, not just the history, but also the people and the culture here. We will record this event. We're recording right now. We're going to record the introductions. We're going to skip the recording of the documentary itself, and then we'll also come back to recording the Q&A session at the end. We'll ask that everybody remain muted throughout the program, but feel free to use the chat feature. And any of your questions, if it's something small and minor, I'll try to answer that as we go along. If it's something major, we'll try to, save those questions for the end. But feel encouraged to use that chat feature. Today we have a really special treat for you. A film with many Asheville and many Western North Carolina connections. Many of you may even know some of the people interviewed or mentioned or discussed in this documentary. This film is titled Guardians of Our Troubled Waters. And it tells the stories of pioneers who worked to save and to clean the French Broad and the Pigeon Rivers, as well as the Florida Everglades. Joining us is award-winning director David Weintraub. David has been an oral historian and filmmaker for over 20 years. His films have appeared on PBS stations around the country and at film festivals around the world. He also has another great documentary on the flood of 1916 with more Asheville and Western North Carolina connections if you're interested in seeing that. David is also director of the Center for Cultural Preservation, which seeks to preserve the rich heritage of the mountains through oral history documentation and through recording of locals. This group helps to pass on the stories through documentary films. And I'll let David talk a little bit more about that. For more information, though, about David's work here and for snippets of some of those oral history interviews, you can visit the website saveculture.org. Again, that's saveculture.org. And now, without any further delay, we'll turn this over to our special guest, David.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be with you guys today, at least be with you in the sense of 2020, be with you. One of the things I love most about filmmaking is the opportunity to show films and have these discussions with community members. And it's been really tough to be able to do that when community members are so virtual. And but I've come to appreciate the virtues of Zoom. And so hopefully we can make this a success. And then next year in 2021, we can do some of these future programs more person-to-person, face-to-face. I'm in the midst right now of working on a film about moonshining in the mountains, which I hope to be out late this spring, early this summer, and maybe it'll just be in time when we can actually do stuff together again. But I got my start as a filmmaker actually with a little reel-to-reel tape recorder back when I was a kid. My parents gave me this little tape recorder, and I used to sit down with my grandparents. And my grandmother knew 150 old Yiddish songs from the old country, and her old country was Poland. And she'd sing me the songs, she'd tell me these stories, and the stories, changed each time she told them, and the conflicts got larger and the battles got bigger, and she became more of the hero each time. But I was just fascinated by the life that she lived, and so some part of her continued in me in making, doing oral histories and making films. And we've done over nearly 400 oral histories in Western North Carolina over the years. And some of those have become documentary films. There's about 36 films that have been out. And some of which you can find on the website, saveculture.org. But let me tell you a little bit about this film and how it got started, and then we can get started. And so this film kind of grew up in my own mind given my own personal relationship with rivers and streams. I grew up in a major city downwind from a landfill. And you always knew when you were getting to the nearest stream because you could smell it long before you got there. And the stream near my house was called Spring Creek, and it has this idyllic sound. You know, you think of the birds and the trees and the cows, and actually the Spring Creek was filled with construction debris, dredging materials. Its tributaries were covered by a bus depot, a sanitation incinerator, and a massive wastewater treatment plant. So every time it rained, millions and millions of gallons of raw sewage would go into Jamaica Bay after the heavy rainstorms. And every once in a while they'd find a body. It was so bad that actually the mob would dump bodies into Spring Creek because they knew nobody in their right mind would go anywhere near there. So honestly, Jimmy Hoffa might have been my next door neighbor, and I never knew it. Maybe I could smell him, but I couldn't see him. But growing up, I just thought all waterways were supposed to be like this. They're supposed to be smelly and stinky and filled with trash. And that's how my first feeling was as a kid. But I was lucky. My parents ultimately became school teachers, and we had the summers off, and I got to go to the country when I was 7 years old. And I almost remember kind of the moment when I could breathe for the first time. You know, when you're living in Brooklyn, you know, everything always smells. And then we opened up our windows when we got to the Catskill Mountains, and all of a sudden the air smelled sweet, and I could, you know, take a deep breath, and it was wonderful. And it was just such a memorable moment to think that, you know, all my life until 7, I hadn't breathed before. But I got to catch frogs and snakes and salamanders and meander, you know, hang out in the rivers and streams. And I kind of felt like I died and went to heaven. And so part of the reason why I came to Western North Carolina is I wanted my son to know that streams were places where not to avoid, but to actually enjoy, that they were an essential part of our community, the lifeblood of our community. And that's what kind of got me interested in the history of rivers and streams and the waterways here, is the native perspective on waterways is so different than the Western ethos. The Cherokee looked at every waterway as something that was sacred and had to be protected, where the Western ethos is about dominion and control. And in this region, we've kind of seen the pendulum swing back and forth from stewardship and away. There was a time not that long ago when most of our rivers and streams were filled with the pollution coming from mills and tanneries and straight piping. Nobody would consider the French Broad being a source of drinking water. They'd think you were going to be poisoning somebody if you did something like that. But things changed, and we have more recent stewards like Wilma Dykeman who woke us up to the destruction and helped our community become more geared to stewardship. But the growth and development is still causing some serious impacts here. We don't have the major manufacturing plants like we used to. We sent them all to China, right? But that doesn't mean we don't have issues here from development and agriculture, which means, once again, we need a wake-up call to understand what's going on. And so I'm hoping that this film is part of the harmony and chorus of wake-up calls to alert us to be more engaged in our natural resources. So without further ado, guardians of our troubled waters, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about it after the film. So let's get you on. Stewardship and away again, and I guess one of the things I learn a lot in making films, and one of the things I learned in making this film is that the pendulum isn't this thing that comes from the sky. It's not this force that we have no control of. We are the pendulum. We can decide, in addition to understanding the history of our community, is we can be part of the change in our community. Once we understand it, you know, I think it's our obligation to be part of doing something to better it. And so we can nudge our political people. We can write the letters to the editor. We can stand up at city council and commissioner meetings. We can join local organizations who are repairing stream banks and planting trees and cleaning up trash and advocating for stronger environmental standards. We can be the pendulum that nature needs us to become the eyes and ears of our rivers and streams. And you know, we have this wonderful bounty around us, and you know, it's more than hiking, it's more than paddling. Stewardship is not a passive process, it's not a spectator sport. And so that's what I learned, and hopefully we can pass that on to all of us. Anyway, happy to take anyone's questions, comments, hysterical outbursts. Historical outbursts.
Well, if I may interject right now, while we're waiting on other questions, I kind of wanted to ask, I see a difference between, you know, say the French Broad and the Pigeon, Western North Carolina rivers. I mean, obviously we're in a place it's a very pretty place, right? And I think maybe in some ways it's been easier to get environmental activism in such a, you know, a pretty place. And then you have the Everglades, which, you know, was just seen as that kind of nuisance by a lot of newcomers to the area. And so I'm kind of wondering, what led you to include the Everglades with this story, or did this originally, you know, was the aim originally focused on the Everglades and then you incorporated?
No, actually, I guess when I was thinking about heroes, about water in the South, I know a lot about Wilma Dykeman. I wasn't blessed to meet her personally, but you know, one of the first things I did when I got here was to read The French Broad, her famous book. And to me, that should be every welcome mat. You know, as soon as you move here, you got to read that book. It's not necessarily a legal obligation, but a moral obligation. But also, I learned so much about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas over the years, and I just kind of felt like these two were like spiritual sisters. They both were very powerful women at a time when women weren't supposed to be talking at all. They were supposed to be involved in garden clubs, not environmental advocacy. They were both eloquent speakers. They both got famous by publishing a book that was part of the American River series. They both wore these incredible hats. I just thought there was just so much in common, and I thought the struggle to fight for the Everglades and for the French Broad were very similar as well. I've spent a lot of time paddling both, and I think the Everglades is amazing. It's just, it's a subtle beauty where there's no mountains, you know, around there, and so you have to kind of adjust your sense. But once you're in there, it's just fascinating. And the Pigeon was an incredible place. You have to remember that the paper plant has been in there since 1908. It's been causing damage for, you know, 112 years. And it's only been the last few years that that's been reversed. And so there's a lot of fixing to be done. But, you know, some of the old pictures that I've seen and talking to the elders, it was absolutely a spectacular place. And I was the one with the camera on that whitewater rafting boat, and it's pretty beautiful as well. So I think what happens is that sometimes we lose perspective that our place is the most beautiful of all. But I've spent some time in all of them, and I think they're all spectacular. And I think from an environmental advocacy standpoint, sometimes when you look at other places, it becomes a really good mirror for our own. You know, we're too personally attached to where we are, and then when we see what happened in other places, you say, how in the hell could they have done? And then you say, oh my God, this is exactly what we've done as well. So I thought they were important parallel stories, and you know, as I said, sometimes I think the significance of that power comes from looking at places that we don't have the personal attachment to. And you know, I personally spent a lot of time in the Everglades, so I do have a personal attachment to most of it, and more recently to the pigeon, and of course the French Broad. So so that's how I went about telling the story. And I know in a way the Everglades is such a different place than here, but in the same vein, the struggle was the same. You know, and the native connection was the same, and the battle is the same. It's profit versus protecting the natural resources that sustain us. And
Yeah. That's something I've always been interested in, is kind of that difference between, you know, who takes care of the pollution upstream versus who takes care of it downstream, you know, when it's flowing into them. And I think that the quote from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, you know, where she's describing duties to, you know, both the people upstream and downstream, you know, this group has to take care of their problems, this group has to take care of their problems.
And then what Wilma Dykeman said too, to me, is very powerful, is that none of us own these waterways. You know, these we all have an obligation. She could very easily have said, "Champion Paper, it's all your fault," but we all contribute. You know, if are we fertilizing our lawns when we can find more sustainable things to do, or are we cutting the grass all the way to the stream so that we can have a beautiful look? But there's nothing in nature to slow down the storm water that comes after the big rains. And we have big rains all the time these days. You know, they say the 100-year storm happens every 9 years now in Western North Carolina. And so we're part of we can be part of the problem, and we can be part of the solution. You know, are we buying plastic containers all the time, or are we buying in bulk when we have the opportunity to do that? There's all these little things that add up to the rescue that nature needs, and the rescue that we need, because, you know, we're not different than nature. We're part of nature. We depend on nature, and, you know, we just kind of assume everything's coming from China anyway, so what do we have to worry about a local waterway anymore? And you know, that's the wake-up call I think we all need to have.
I was wondering also, can you talk a little bit more about how the efforts of these various guardians changed over time? I mean, did you know, did Wilma Dykeman and Douglas and some of these other early advocates have to change their strategies or modify their approaches?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, here's the similarity between Wilma and Marjorie is they both wrote a book. And they thought, well, that's enough, right? I wrote this important book, and they were both incredible books. And people actually read books those days, you know, as opposed to now that, you know, if it's not on, if you can't watch a 3-minute YouTube video, forget about it. But I think as time went on, they realized that they had an obligation to be more than that. And the book gave them some renown, and it gave them a powerful, prestigious platform. And so they realized they had to do more than sign, you know, books at book signings and then lectures. They had to be part of changing the dynamic. And so Marjorie, I think she was 88 years old when she became the advocate. She lived to 108. And she was an advocate from till 105. I think, you know, she started to lose a few of her faculties, but she didn't lose a step until 105. And Wilma Dykeman as well was a fighter to the end. And I think they realized that, you know, writing was one thing, capturing that history was one thing, but putting that history into a practice was what was necessary. And so I think they moved from artistic types to fervent leaders. And I thought, you know, that's part of the issue here too, is that it wasn't just Rachel Carson somewhere else. You know, there was some very powerful women, particularly women, who were the leaders of these battles. And if we understand the foremothers and the forefathers of that battle, then we can learn to continue that on. And one really, really, really important thing I don't want to lose and forget is that there was Democrats and Republicans involved on both sides. You know, today we think, well, it has, you know, if it has to do with environmental protection, we're not going to get a conservative. And actually, you know, the battle for the French Broad River, preventing those dams, the Republicans were more fervent than the Democrats, but they both were involved. Charles Taylor was the hero, one of the heroes. Charles Taylor no one would confuse him as an environmentalist, but he led the fight for those conservatives who saw that this was an issue of taking of the land, the Fifth Amendment issue. And so people didn't say, oh, you know, that's a bunch of crap. You know, this is really about environmental preservation. Now people saw, hey, there's something we both agree on. We want to be good stewards of these rivers. We don't want our land to be turned into big lakes for recreation for people somewhere else. And so people found a common ground. And that's, you know, to me, maybe that's the most important lesson of all, is that there was a way to do that in the past, and maybe we can find a way to do that today. You know, a lot of folks I talk to who are newcomers to this area complain to me about those damn natives. You know, if they would only wake up and join, you know, they don't believe in climate change and blah, 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 blah. But they're not building mansions on top of steep slopes, you know. They're not building McMansions and major developments. It's people from out of town moving into those homes and building those developments. And, you know, for a lot of time, for many generations, they were pretty good stewards. So I think, you know, there's this unwillingness to believe that the other can be a friend and a partner and an ally in this battle. And I think that would be incorrect, because I have had a lot of great discussions about climate change and never said the word climate change with people who consider themselves conservative, because I think stewardship is just as powerful and it's just as meaningful, and it reaches the same solution. So I don't use the lingo, but we still get another adherent to saving our rivers and streams. And so that's what Marjorie and Wilma and the Upper French Broad Defense Association people and the Pigeon River Action Group, that's what they taught me.
Yeah, I think if you look back even further, the 1911 Weeks Act and all the advocacy leading up to that, I mean, that enjoyed bipartisan support, and it was both Jeter C. Pritchard here in Nashville, and then some Eastern Democrats as well, who were, you know, they're all advocating for you know, protection of navigable rivers and the forest that went along with those. I think another thing I wanted to ask is, you know, like Wilma Dykeman, you rely very heavily on oral history in this and in your work. And I would like to know a little bit more about, you know, what insights oral history gives you in this film, or, you know, what insights jumped out to you that you got from oral history instead of, you know, necessarily just archival research.
Well, you know, they say the victors are the ones who write the history books, and I think, you know, history in this country is based upon great men and great events, and sometimes you realize it ain't great men, and it's not the great events, but it's the little people, it's the average person. When you get their perspective on what happened, it turns the tables on what actually went on, what the forces are in motion. You know, we don't study history in this country to understand the process, you know, how things led up, how one thing led to the other. We just look at these events as if they just came out of thin air. And when I do these oral histories, I see the passion, you know, I see the passion in people's eyes. People aren't just collecting photographs, and they're not just collecting events and dates, you know, like what people are forced to learn in school. But they live their lives, you know, in history. You know, this moment right now will be history. And so I think sometimes the subtleties and the beauty of the life that people lived and the connectivity that people had is very powerful. You know, I always say that when I sit down and do these oral histories, I'm sitting down with a rich person. And they may not have had two nickels to rub together, but what they had was this richness of community, connection to the land and connection to faith, that I think, you know, we're losing. You know, I have stuff, you know, I have some nice things, I have a nice house, but I feel, you know, ridden with poverty when I realize, you know, I can't sit on my front porch and have a gathering of neighbors, especially these days. But even before then, because that's not what people do. They have this little clicker, and as they're approaching the house, they put the clicker on, the door comes up, the car goes in. You know, their front door probably hasn't ever been opened except for a package from Amazon. And so we've lost those connections, and those connections are what define our community. It allowed people to be so engaged in protecting their natural environment, and why they were so engaged in protecting their cultural history. I'm just so fascinated when you can walk and sit down and people can recite, you know, who their great grandfather was, and what role they played, and how much moonshine they made, and, you know, the molasses that they produced, and what things, you know, helped them and what things hurt them, the challenges that they had, the successes that they had. There's just so many lessons there to be learned. And I feel that because of that lack of connection these days, that intimacy between people and communities, we're losing so much of what makes us human. And so much of why these things that happened in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s were so successful. You know, can we replicate that? Yes. But to me, the most important thing about history is not the remembering of the names and the dates, but the learning the lessons and applying those things to today. You know, because what's the point? You know, to have a book, you know, that sits on a shelf and collects dust, or to be part of this chain of events that has this continuum across the generations that you're a part of, that your kids are a part of, that the grandkids are a part of, that we all feel that that we can make a difference, and that that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Well, I don't want to keep you all night, but I'll conclude. I want to ask you one more question, and that is, what was your favorite part of this documentary process, or was there any? What was the most interesting tidbit that you uncovered?
That's hard because there's a lot of choices up there. I loved spending time with my son and the underwater camera looking for hellbenders. We got some great assistance from the North Carolina wildlife people to help us locate where they are, and I had never seen a hellbender out of captivity before, and I got to see dozens and dozens of them, and that was really, really cool. I love meeting with the elders, the native elders, the Mukwasuki and the Seminole and the Scots-Irish, in the many, many counties and states that we did this in. There's just so many powerful lessons there from native life and native thought that I think has gotten lost in the translation. There's so much. And what I guess I love the most of all is when I can go back to all the people who played such an important role in the film and be able to sit there and show the film to them, and watch the tears in their eyes when they realize that their passions have importance to other people. That it is, you know, these days I think we kind of feel like we all stand alone, that it's only us, you know. And there's still a small grouping of people left in East Tennessee who are part of that movement, and only a few people left. There's still a few people left who are part of that Wilma Dykeman contingent, you know, who were part of the Everglades battle, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And I got to meet them and share their successes and challenges, and it was nice that there was younger people too at those events who hopefully, you know, there was this passing of the torch in a sense. So I love the whole process. And in this film, particularly given that I always feel like my life is on the crossroads of environmental protection and cultural preservation, that this was a great medium for me to work in. And those are my favorite films to make. I've made a few of them, and those are my favorites. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I also greatly enjoyed seeing all the places that I'm familiar with too, and then a bunch of faces and names that I'm familiar with. It was a it was a good look at a place I'm familiar with through kind of a different lens. Well, thank you very much, David, for being here. I'm going to give a quick plug for the website. So let me share my screen right fast. So, like I said, David's website at saveculture.org. The Center for Cultural Preservation has a lot of the oral histories, a lot of David's projects, and ways to support that mission. And also, if you're interested in today's program, we'll have it recorded. That'll be available on our website, the Western North Carolina Historical Association. And we also have a few other virtual events, a few screenings coming up. Don't forget, on December 16th, just a few more weeks, we'll have the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Awards. We'll have 6 finalists joining us, and we'll crown the winner that night. They'll all read from and discuss their works a little bit. And then on January 14th, we also have another documentary screening. This one's on Julian Price, who was another pivotal figure in Asheville and Western North Carolina history. So thank you all for participating and joining us tonight. We hope you will come back and join us for some more programs. But once again, thank you very much, David, for all you did tonight.
You got it. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Have a good night.
As well.